from Spain, and 8 years in service. Manuel Antonio de Lozoya, Español. So Lozoya was always in the back of my mind when I saw that name listed on the cenotaph at the Alamo. Francisco de la Cerda, Español. And it's interesting because you'll have the Z's and the mixed with the C's, and you know that's important because, for example, there was a Chirinos and or Chirino, and I asked a friend of mine from Saltillo if he knew anybody who was Chirino, and he was like, no, but when I said Chirinos, it was like, sí, hay bastante de Chirinos. I was like, well, that's like one letter difference, but people say, is it with the Gonzalez with the Z, is it Vasquez with the Z or an S? And so if it happens in the Spanish archives where it changes around, then of course, that could happen naturally later on, especially later on, like for some of the descendants in Louisiana who completely translate their name or change the Hispanic name completely around to anglicize it. Perhaps we'll say some more about that later. Just like with the Native Americans, names being Hispanicized. But nonetheless, there are a number of names here. Juan Antonio Ramos, in which figures into those receiving lands at Mission San Antonio de Valero, and et cetera, et cetera. But you saw also the caste labels of these different individuals, that over time they could change their labels by military service, by acquiring property, distinguishing themselves, marrying into other families. Not a bad idea if your daughter ends up with a French soldier, like Lieutenant Joseph Gonzalez, whose daughter Victoria ends up eloping with Jean-Baptiste Durban, who was Saint Denis' main business partner. And supposedly, Lieutenant Gonzalez, when he wrote Governor Bustillo Ceballos, or Governor Sandoval at the time in 1736, he didn't know anything because he was the interim commandant supposed to be policing the border and keeping the French out. And meanwhile, his daughter's running off with a French soldier. But,
so that's how they changed his name.
But, well, yes, and then the grandson, there was a Manuel Berban, and it turns out ends up in San Antonio, and they change it around, and I think maybe it's because of the grandson who ends up serving with Gonzalez at Los Odayas in the 1750s, that it's like, can you imagine grandfather and grandson serving in the military? It's like today, it's like the grandchildren asking the grandpas, well, tell us about World War II. But what's interesting is that you have a de la Cerda, and I think it was Gertrudis, who was the wife of Lieutenant Gonzalez, that may have orchestrated some of this too, with the help of the Franciscan, with help with the Jesuit, such that when they eloped, they got married over in Natchitoches. And whether it was Lieutenant Gonzalez knew or not, it's the fact that they did this, and they continue to establish that kinship with French Natchitoches. But we move on. And this is just giving an overview of literally how close Los Odayas is to Natchitoches. Just about 15 miles due west, and the border of the Arroyo Hondo was in between both, and you can see what was considered Spanish territory here, the British and the French, but those are European borders, boundaries. Historian Juliana Barr talks about the geographies of power, and she says that when the Spanish settled at Los Odayas, when you look at it, you realize the fort was not established in the heartland of the Caddo territory, but Presidio de Texas was closer because that's near present San Agustin. But basically, they were on the borders of the Caddo nation, so that the Caddos can be watching the Spanish, can be watching the French, just as the Spanish or the French would be watching the Caddos. And the Caddos of East Texas that were part of the Hassanite Confederacy were just one of three, in addition to the Natchitoches Confederacy in Louisiana, as well as the Caddo Hadacho proper Confederacy in southwestern Arkansas, southeastern Oklahoma, and northwestern Louisiana. so that there were several cattle confederacy, and there's a tendency to